Hubby just bought us a new toy for the At Jenny's Place workshop, and I am so excited to share it with you. I can't wait to get my hands on this new beauty. So we're gonna head out to the workshop to unbox it, and then we're gonna head over to the scrap wood pile, find ourselves some pieces of wood that we can DIY with that I know we could easily turn into fall home decor.
Oh, she smells so good.
Good.
She's pretty.
And so now that we had our new toy to play with, I had to head over to our wood pile that's hidden under our front porch. It's a total mess, complete dog's breakfast. But we're going to be redoing the porch probably next spring, so for now it's just gonna stay the way it is. But I know we can find some pieces of wood underneath here that we can definitely DIY and make into high-end decor. Last year, our neighbors took apart the deck that led to their gazebo, and I asked our neighbors if I could keep their scrap pieces of wood, and they were kind enough to let me do so. And so I think we're going to use this piece here to create some fall DIYs. So using the nice new shiny miter saw, we're just going to cut this piece of wood down to 3 different sizes, one small, one medium, and one large. Now when I cut these pieces down, I used 2 of the end pieces because it had that nice worn weathered look, but the third piece on both ends was a fresh cut. Now I chose this one with a little dent on the top because I thought it added some character, but we need to make this fresh cut end look like the others. To do this, all you're going to need is a stippling brush and some antiquing wax, and you're just going to stipple that antiquing wax onto the fresh cut wood. Next, use some light gray paint. I'm just going in with Folk Art's French Linen because I happen to have it on hand and it's a nice light gray color. And again, going in with the stippling brush to stipple that all over the antiquing wax. Blend that in with a little bit more of that antiquing wax and just work back and forth with that antiquing wax and that light gray color until you get a look that you really like. Now I was still finding this end kind of too fresh looking, so another trick I like to do is to go in with a hammer and just beat it with both ends, scraping back and forth and just really working that wood, and then going in with a bit more of that antiquing wax and working it and blending it all together. Now I liked the look of the bare wood, but I wanted to give it a little something something. So I'm going in with a little bit of Folk Art in Milk Jug chalk paint. I'm also going to use some Folk Art in Oatmeal. It's sort of a light green color, definitely not the color of oatmeal, at least not any oatmeal I've ever made. And I'm also going to use some of the Folk Art chalk paint in Seaside Villa, I think it's called. And in my craft stash, I had these really delightful looking stencils, and I'm just going to pick out 3 of them that sort of fit the size of each of the wood pieces. And using the individual chalk paints, I'm just going to paint each of them one of the colors. For the stem, I thought it might be fun to use some hot glue and some square wooden beads that I got from the dollar store and just glue the 2 or 3 beads together, and we're going to use these as the stem. I'm just going to hot glue that to the top of each of the center of the wood pieces. Now you could totally stop here and call it a day, but I felt like it still needed another something something. So I had these rose faux florals that I got from, I think it was Dollarama a few years back, and they had these dark rich green leaves on them, and I thought that those would complement the dark wood really well. So I just popped off a couple of these leaves, used some hot glue, and applied them to the top of each of the wood pumpkins. Love these rustic pumpkins almost as much as I love the new miter saw. There you go, our first scrap wood DIY. For this next DIY, we're just going to use this perfect piece of scrap wood that happened to be hanging around that pile, and it really doesn't need much done to it. So I just started by measuring out 2.5 feet and then cutting down and then cutting out 2 pieces that size. Then I trimmed off the end piece that was left over and then cut that in half. Basically, we're making a rustic wood crate with this wood. To keep things simple, I went in with my nail gun, nailed everything into place, and then headed out to the garden where I had a bunch of hydrangeas growing. I'm going to cut these down, put these in water, let the water dry up until the hydrangeas dry, and then use these inside the wood crate to display them. So beautiful, don't you think? For this next DIY, we're just going to use another plain board. This one isn't quite as worn as the first one we're using, but that's okay. We're going to do the exact same thing we did the first DIY and cut this board down into 3 sizes: small, medium, and large. Use some sandpaper to sand off any of those rough edges. Now, unlike the first piece of wood we used, this piece of wood really doesn't have all that much interest, so we're going to use some of this terracotta pumpkin colored chalk paint that I got from Amazon, and using a chippy brush, we're just going to apply this orange paint to the front, back, and sides of each of the wood pieces, but we're going for a really worn look here. You're not trying to cover it perfectly. You want this to look distressed. Now, just like that first DIY we did, we do have a fresh cut top, so we're going to use some of that antiquing wax and a light gray paint to just distress that top, making it look like the rest. And then once that is dry, go in with a little bit of that orange paint and paint each of the tops. I had some little branch pieces, and I knew that this would be perfect at the top of each of the little wood pumpkins as the stem, so using a little bit of wood glue, just apply each of the stems to the top of your wood pieces. To make these look even more like a pumpkin, they need a little curlicue. Now, the easiest way I found to do this is to use some twine and coat it with a bunch of Mod Podge. Yes, you're gonna get a little messy here, but what's the fun in DIYing if you can't get your hands dirty? So just apply that with a paintbrush and then run your fingers through the twine, and then take the Mod Podge soaked twine, wrap it around your paintbrush, and then set it aside and let the Mod Podge dry. Now, you could totally stop here and just leave these pumpkins as is if you're into super simple, but I felt like these needed a little something. So I had these beautiful decorative burlap rolls, and we're going to use this to just add a little bit more interest to these wood pumpkins. Now, if you can't find similar decorative burlap rolls, you could always buy these burlap sacks from Dollar Tree and just use these instead. And if you wanted to add a little bit of detail, just use a stencil and stencil some paint onto the front. Now, we want this burlap to cover the front, sides, and bottom of each of the pumpkins. Basically, we're making a pouch. So lie the pumpkin down on top of the cut burlap and then cut the burlap to each corner of the bottom of the pumpkin. Using some hot glue that burlap flap to the bottom part of your pumpkin. And use a little bit more of that hot glue to glue down the flaps on the side, making sure to do this on both sides. Then trim the little triangle pieces that are poking out at the bottom so that you just end up with 2 rectangle pieces on both sides. And then once again, using your hot glue gun, glue these rectangle pieces to the side of your wood piece. Okay, now it's time to go back to that Mod Podge wrapped twine and gently remove it from your paintbrush and then cut these down. These are going to make the most adorably rustic curlicues for each of your pumpkins. Using some hot glue, just hot glue them down. For the finishing touch, just use some fall faux florals or even some actual real wheat and slide those into the front of the pockets of each of your pumpkins, and there you go. I just think these pumpkins are absolutely adorable. They are so charming, but I'm dying to know what you think in the comments below. For this next DIY, I had this leftover wood from a wood crate that I had built for another video. I'll link it here above. And I'm just, honestly, this step isn't necessary. We cut this down freshly from a piece of wood that we had lying around, and I just wanted to use hubby's new toy. It's just so much fun to just put this through the planer and get the wood really nice and smooth. But you totally could find a piece of wood like this at, Home Depot or in your wood pile, and you definitely don't need this tool. I truly can't help myself. I keep finding any excuse to use this machine again. It's so much fun. Going in with the miter saw, just cut these down into equal pieces so that you end up with 7 blocks. Now, you don't need either of these tools to do this DIY. All you need is a block of wood, and really a miter box will do ya just fine. You're going to want to make these edges nice and smooth, so go in with a little bit of sandpaper and just sand away any of the rough bits from cutting it, and then smooth out any of the corners so that you just get a nice gentle rounded edge. Next, go in with a little bit of antiquing wax and paint all 4 sides and the top and the bottom with this antiquing wax so that you can completely cover each of the blocks. Let that antiquing wax dry completely. I recommend overnight, and then go in with a little bit of white chalk paint, and you're going to start with one layer that you're going to apply very distressed like, especially along the edges. And then once that's had a chance to dry, go in with a second coat of that white chalk paint, but this time centering it more in the center part, leaving the outside looking distressed. One of my thrift store vases came with these wooden sticks inside them, and we're just going to use some miter shears, and we're going to cut these sticks down on an angle on one side and flat on the other. We're going to use these as the stems for our pumpkin. Place a dollop of hot glue on the flat side of each of the little twigs, and then just hot glue that to the center of each of your blocks. I still had some smaller pieces of that curly Q twine that we made for the other DIY, so I just cut these down into smaller pieces and then applied those with some hot glue as well. This next step is totally optional, but I felt like it needed just a little something, so I went in with a bit of that decorative burlap again. I cut down some leaves. Now, they were too small to make them look actually like pumpkin leaves, so I just kind of went with the basic leaf cut, and then using some hot glue, just glued these down to the top of each of the pumpkins. Now we're going to turn these blocks into a bit of a game, and we're going to do this by using a little bit more of that terracotta pumpkin colored orange chalk paint and some letter stencils. These ones are from the Martha Stewart line, but really any letter stencils will do just fine. And using a small stenciling brush, we're going to apply that orange paint to the blocks, both on the front, back, and both sides. And we're going to do this in, again, a really distressed way, because, well, here we do things the distressed way. Mainly because it's the most forgiving. Spell each of the words out onto the blocks. For the 2 words that only had 6 letters, I did these on the front and the back of the blocks, and then using a stencil that was a design from the other stencils that we did the other pumpkins with, I just applied that to the blocks that would only have 6 letters. I hope that makes sense. Now you could totally stop here and leave those letters nice and bright, but I wanted to make these look like they'd been around for decades, so I went in with some sandpaper and just distressed those letters and the white paint just a little bit more. And the finishing look, this game is fun. It's actually harder than it looks. You need to give it a try. These don't just look charming, they're also a ton of fun. For this DIY, I had this old wooden Lazy Susan that had a bit of a crack in the middle, so I went in with some antiquing wax and applied 3 coats of this antiquing wax to the entire top and sides of the wooden Lazy Susan, and then let that dry completely overnight. Then I went on Cricut, found one of their free stencil templates, and printed that out just on some cardstock that came with my Cricut when I bought it, and I'm not going to use it to make any cards, so I thought it would be good to use this this as a stencil. And then I went in with just a little bit of that French linen chalk paint from Folk Art and a nice thick stenciling brush and distressed painted this on. So I wasn't going for perfection here. I wanted some areas to be darker, other areas to be lighter. Now, as I was doing this, I also realized that, it doesn't have a rim. So I just decided to sort of apply the paint in a distressed, light way around the scalloped edge so that in the end you could still see the outline of the stencil. Then I simply applied a top coat to this, let that dry, and now I have a beautiful spinning tray that I can display all of my fall decor on. I just love the way this turned out, and it's definitely going to get more use than it was getting sitting in my kitchen cupboard.
If you enjoyed that, make sure you subscribe. Give me a thumbs up. If you hit that notification bell, it'll let you know the next time I upload. Oh, and you might enjoy these.